When you look at the complete project Gutenberg works of Jane Austen, you aren't just looking at a few stories, but a detailed map of the social minefields of Regency-era England. Austen's world is one of drawing rooms, formal balls, and strict class hierarchies, where a single wrong word or a misplaced glance could ruin a person's reputation for life. For the women she writes about, marriage wasn't just about romance, it was often the only way to ensure financial survival. Let's start with one of her most famous stories, Pride and Prejudice. This narrative centers on the Bennet family, who have 5 daughters and a very precarious future. Because of a legal restriction called an entail, the family estate cannot be inherited by the daughters, only by a male relative. This means that when Mr. Bennet dies, his daughters and wife will be left with almost nothing. This creates a desperate, often frantic atmosphere where the mother, Mrs. Bennet, is obsessed with marrying her daughters off to wealthy men. The story really kicks off when a rich bachelor named Mr. Bingley moves into the neighborhood. He's kind and easygoing, and he quickly falls for the eldest daughter, Jane. But it's the second daughter, Elizabeth, who captures our attention. Elizabeth is witty, perceptive, and a bit too quick to judge. At a local ball, she meets Mr. Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy. Darcy is incredibly wealthy and high-born, but he's also arrogant and dismissive. He famously insults Elizabeth, and she immediately decides he is a terrible person. For a long time, the plot is a dance of misunderstandings. Elizabeth's prejudice against Darcy grows as she hears lies about him from a charming soldier named Mr. Wickham. Meanwhile, Darcy finds himself unexpectedly attracted to Elizabeth's spirit and intelligence, though he struggles with his own pride regarding her lower social standing. He eventually proposes to her, but he does it in a way that is almost insulting, basically telling her that he loves her, despite how inferior her family is. Elizabeth rejects him flatly. The turning point comes when Darcy writes her a letter. He explains the truth about Wickham, revealing that the soldier is actually a liar and a gambler who tried to seduce Darcy's own sister. This forces Elizabeth to realize that her first impressions were wrong. The climax happens when Elizabeth's youngest sister, Lydia, runs away with Wickham. This is a social catastrophe that could ruin the marriage prospects of all the Bennet sisters. In a secret act of generosity, Darcy tracks them down and pays Wickham a massive sum of money to marry Lydia, saving the family from disgrace without taking any credit for it. When Elizabeth finds out, her resentment vanishes. She realizes that Darcy's true character is defined by his actions, not his social awkwardness. The story ends with Jane and Bingley marrying, and Elizabeth and Darcy finding a marriage based on genuine respect and love. Then we have the story of Emma Woodhouse. Emma is very different from Elizabeth Bennet. She is wealthy, comfortable, and has no financial reason to marry. This gives her a dangerous amount of free time, which she spends playing matchmaker for everyone else in her village. She takes a young woman named Harriet Smith under her wing, convinced that Harriet is too good for the local farmers and should instead marry a gentleman. Emma's interference creates a comedy of errors. She convinces Harriet to reject a perfectly good suitor and instead pine for Mr. Elton, who has no intention of marrying her. Throughout this, Emma is guided and often corrected by Mr. Knightley, a principled neighbour and family friend. Knightley is the only person who isn't afraid to tell Emma when she's being manipulative or delusional. The tension builds as a charming man named Frank Churchill arrives in town. Emma thinks she might be in love with him, and she spends a lot of time analysing their interactions. However, it's all a facade. The climax occurs during a trip to Box Hill. In a moment of misplaced confidence, Emma mocks a poor woman named Miss Bates. Mr. Knightley immediately reprimands her, telling her that her behaviour was cruel and arrogant. This is the moment Emma's delusions are shattered. She realises that in her attempt to control everyone's romantic lives, she has been blind to her own heart. She discovers that Frank Churchill was actually secretly engaged to someone else the whole time, and more importantly, she realises she has deep feelings for Mr. Knightley. The story ends with Emma growing up emotionally and marrying Knightley, finally finding a partner who is her intellectual and moral equal. In Sense and Sensibility, Austen explores the tension between the head and the heart through 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. After their father dies, the sisters and their mother are forced to leave their family home and move to a modest cottage because of the laws of inheritance. Eleanor is the anchor of the family. She represents sense. She is pragmatic, controlled, and keeps her emotions hidden to protect others. She falls in love with Edward Ferrars, a kind but reserved man. However, their relationship is stalled because Edward is secretly engaged to a manipulative woman named Lucy Steele. Eleanor suffers in silence, maintaining her composure even as her heart breaks. Marianne, on the other hand, represents sensibility. She is impulsive, passionate, and believes that love should be an all-consuming fire. She falls head over heels for a dashing man named Willoughby. She ignores all the warning signs and throws herself into a romantic fantasy. But Willoughby turns out to be a mercenary. He abandons Marianne for a woman with a larger fortune, leaving Marianne devastated. She falls into a deep depression and eventually a near-fatal illness. The resolution of their stories comes through a shift in perspective. Marianne realizes that her impulsive passion was a form of blindness, and that the steady, quiet devotion of Colonel Brandon, a man she had previously dismissed as boring, is what she actually needs. Meanwhile, Lucy Steele's engagement to Edward falls apart, allowing Eleanor and Edward to finally marry. The sisters find stability not through wild passion, but through a balance of emotional honesty and moral integrity. Finally, there is Persuasion, which feels more mature and melancholic than the other stories. It follows Anne Elliot, a woman who has spent years being overlooked by her vain and status-obsessed father. 8 years prior, Anne had been engaged to a young naval officer named Frederick Wentworth. However, she was persuaded by her family to break off the engagement because Wentworth had no money and no social standing. Anne has spent nearly a decade regretting that decision. When Wentworth returns as a wealthy and successful captain, he is still hurt by her rejection. He is polite but cold, and he spends much of the story flirting with other women to make Anne jealous. Anne has to navigate the pain of seeing the man she loves while remaining the quiet, supportive daughter her family expects. The resolution happens when Wentworth realizes that Anne's feelings for him never faded. In a famous and moving scene, he writes her a letter confessing that he is still in love with her and that his pride has finally given way to his heart. They marry, not because of social pressure or financial need, but because they have both grown into people who value character over rank. When we step back and look at these stories together, a few major themes emerge. The most prominent is the gap between appearance and reality. In almost every book, there is a character who seems one way but is actually another. Mr. Darcy seems like a villain but is a hero. Willoughby seems like a romantic lead but is a predator. Emma seems like a benevolent guide but is actually a manipulator. Austen is constantly reminding us that the social performance people put on in public is rarely the full truth of who they are. Then there is the brutal reality of social class and marriage. While these books are often remembered as cozy romances, they are actually about survival. The entail in Pride and Prejudice and the loss of the estate in Sense and Sensibility are not just plot points, they are threats of poverty. Austen shows us that for a woman in her time, marriage was the only career path available. The tension in these books often comes from the struggle to find a marriage that is both economically secure and emotionally fulfilling. Austen also spends a lot of time contrasting controlled emotion with impulsive passion. We see this most clearly in the Dashwood sisters. Marianne's sensibility is treated as a dangerous lack of discipline, while Eleanor's sense is praised as a sign of strength. Even Emma's journey is one of learning to move from the impulsive desire to control others to a more disciplined understanding of herself. Reputation and scandal act as the primary drivers of the plot. Lydia's elopement in Pride and Prejudice or the secret engagements in Sense and Sensibility are not just gossip, they are existential threats. In a world where your social standing is your only currency, a scandal is like bankruptcy. Ultimately, the world of Jane Austen is a world of performance. The dances, the formal visits, and the carefully worded letters are all part of a social game. But the heart of her work is the search for authenticity within that game. Her characters find happiness only when they stop playing a role and start being honest with themselves and others. Whether it's Elizabeth and Darcy overcoming their pride, or Anne and Wentworth overcoming their regrets, the goal is always the same: a partnership based on mutual respect, stability, and a deep understanding of the other person's true character.